if you've seen yourself really thrive in another space, and this is a new space where you feel like, hey, I'm sort of crashing and burning here, then it's time to sort of look at the organizational structures.
I'm Rich Frazier.
And I'm Russ Fanos.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, a podcast from IPM Advancement.
We believe strong nonprofits can change the world, and our goal with each episode is to bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders from the nonprofit sector.
Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. Today we're talking about a very important topic for the nonprofit industry, staff burnout and retention. Research has shown that burnout rates in the nonprofit sector are higher than in many other industries. Nonprofit organizations often work with limited resources, tight budgets, and high expectations from stakeholders and beneficiaries, which can create a pretty high stress environment. In addition, many nonprofit professionals are passionate about their mission and may feel personally invested in the success of the organization, which can result in more willingness to work long hours or take on extra responsibilities. This dedication is admirable, but it can also lead to unhealthy boundaries. Burnout can have a significant negative consequence for both employees and organizations, and ultimately it can hurt the nonprofit's ability to deliver on its mission. Today, my guest is Dr. Evisha Ford, author of the book Benches in the Bathroom. Dr. Ford, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Russ. I'm so excited to be here and to be speaking about this very important and timely topic.
Thank you. Would you introduce yourself to our listeners and describe a little bit of your background and experience as it relates to addressing burnout and retention?
Absolutely. So I actually cut my teeth in nonprofits. I'm a social worker and I have worked with homeless youth in the South Side of Chicago and eventually moved on to public education sector and worked as a director of special education and an assistant superintendent, and went on to found my own therapeutic school, an alternative school that serves South Cook and Will County in the Chicagoland area, and have picked up quite a bit of tidbits about leadership and the impact of burnout or compassion fatigue, as we used to call it in the olden days, and the havoc that it can wreak on an organization. Mm-hmm. It's become quite a passion topic, leading to a book that I recently authored, Benches in the Bathroom, which is really about leading a socially, emotionally, and culturally well organization.
Wonderful. Excellent. Well, let's start off at the 30,000-foot view of this issue. And I'm going to share a few statistics, and then I'd like to get your take on kind of where we are in the overall status of burnout and retention kind of post-pandemic. So back in 2016, the Nonprofit Employment Practices Survey came out from Nonprofit HR, and they found at that time that annual staff turnover for nonprofits was 19%. And what's interesting is they found that nonprofits have roughly the same turnover as healthcare, and that's a field that's typically known for pretty high rates of burnout. So fast forward to 2020, and the Center for Effective Philanthropy found that 42% of nonprofit employees reported feeling burned out either very often or always, and 26% reported feeling burned out sometimes. So that's about 7 in 10 employees feeling burned out. And then we take ourselves into the pandemic. In 2021, the Nonprofit Talent Retention Practices Survey came out. It said that more than half of employees said COVID impacted staff retention. 80% of respondents indicated that they don't have formal retention strategies for this, and 23% said decreased morale was the most important factor in turnover. So I'd like to ask you, Dr. Ford, in your experience, did the pandemic make things worse for folks who are on the front lines? It's kind of a question that answers itself.
I think the pandemic was a very eye-opening time for us. Yeah. I'm not sure. Obviously, there was new stressors, and the world at large was impacted by so many new things that we just really didn't have a coping system to deal with, right? And
Yeah.
so that's how we decide what is traumatic or what is stressful beyond our ability to bear, is really our ability to cope with it. And I think what happened is our already full proverbial plates just got tipped over at that point.
Hmm.
It really changed the conditions and the way that, and the challenges that we had to step up to. And so what we found is that these folks who are probably already on the edge of being burned out or stressed out, I think that that pushed them, the need for creativity and the need to innovate in that space and the demand for it. I think that that really shined a light on what was already missing, if that makes sense.
Mm.
And it allowed us to really understand our capacity as humans in a different way, not as human beings, as professionals, as people that in nonprofits specifically who are committed to contributing to a certain mission. It
Yeah.
helped us to understand our limitations. And so I think we also maybe this business of self-care took on a new life during the pandemic. And so I think it also allowed people to name what had probably been just below the surface all
Hmm.
along.
Hmm.
There was a new language that allowed, oh, yes, that does describe, that's exactly how I'm feeling, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it was twofold. I'm not sure that we would have had this time together to talk about this if there hadn't been a pandemic. I don't know that we would have had this time, or the platform would have been created for this topic that's always been really important to me. And I've seen it play out both as a mental health professional,
Hmm.
as someone who's coached leaders for over a decade, for someone who's been brought into organizations to reform it. I've seen this at play in the background, but I'm so glad that there's a platform now to kind of say, what shifts can we make to sort of to mitigate the impact of this experience for people?
So in your view, how does that level of kind of self-care come into play when you're working with folks in this sector, where folks feel really beholden to the work that they're doing? They want to do a good job. They don't want to disappoint the people that they serve. But at some point, there comes that kind of threshold that you reach as someone who's working in the nonprofit industry, where you just say, I need time to step back from this. I need time to heal myself, to take care of myself. How did you see that kind of play out and change in those terms that you just described?
I think that the business of self-care is much more on people's minds, but I
Hmm.
do want to make a comparison. I
Hmm.
think the individual onus for self-care, there's two sides of a coin, right? There's the organizational wellness, right, that
Right,
makes
right.
space for self-care practices, and then there's the individual's responsibility. And I
Yeah.
liken it to the food industry telling us that it's our fault that we're overweight because it's if you have to just burn more calories than you eat, right? And
Right.
that's partially true, but it's also true that the way that we metabolize food has to do with the additives that are in it, the way it's
Yep.
processed, with all these things that we don't see. And so while I do think there's a very real and present responsibility for individuals to mind their self-care, it's also incumbent upon the organizations that work for them to not add packaging and
Yep.
additives and things that make it really difficult for them to really be present. In coaching leaders, and on my team, the folks that I'm coaching most frequently are all in leadership roles at this point.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I promote heavily is really this business of self-awareness. You have to know what you need, because self-care, what's going to work for me as a self-care practice may look totally different for you, Russ,
Yeah.
right? What I realized during the pandemic when I was trapped in the house with two toddlers is that I needed to get out for an hour every day and take a run, or else we weren't going to make it. And it wasn't going
Yeah.
to be COVID that took us out.
Right.
So
Right.
I realized I needed a break midday and I needed to be in nature. I needed to go to my local forest preserve and just take a run and and get out in fresh air. That looked different for everybody. And
Yeah.
so this really has to do with this business of self-awareness, of knowing what you need. I think also there's been a lot of idea about self-care Sundays, or self-care meaning I'm going to get a manicure, I'm going to take a bubble bath. And that is great.
Hmm.
What's going to be more critical are the everyday practices that individuals put in place, whether it's your sleep hygiene or your water intake, knowing being aware of your body enough to know when you need to get up and take a movement break.
Yeah.
Those sort of practices are going to go a lot farther and have a greater impact than getting a manicure, right? And I'm
Yeah.
not against manicures, I'm all for them.
Right.
But as a long-term strategy, that's just not it, right? So there is the individual onus on being aware of yourself, being able to recognize what you're feeling,
Mm-hmm.
and then having the emotional agility to shift it when you need to, right? Like,
Okay.
is this feeling that I'm in, that I'm having, is it serving me in the moment? Is it serving the function that I need? Is it serving the organization where I am emotionally? And then how do I shift that when needed? So a lot of it does have to do with self-awareness and knowing what practices are going to make you, that are going to allow you to serve at your best.
Yeah. So for these leaders that are in these positions, in these management positions, and have the power to kind of shape the environment that folks are working in, they not only have to worry about themselves, they've got to worry about their organization, but they have to also, it sounds like they have to honor the individual that's working with them, their colleagues, the people that report to them. What kind of tools can you recommend for, especially, let's start from the top down, for leaders, for people that are managing teams in these high stress environments? What kind of tools can you suggest for those people?
That's a great question, Russ. Every organization is different and every team is different. But I think that as a leader, the most important thing you can really do is to make connections with the folks on your team. They have to know that you are in their corner and that you're there for them, advocating for them.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to know that you value them beyond just what they contribute to the organization, but rather you value them as a person.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really the number one thing that I can recommend. And it sounds so trite, but I think that there's oftentimes there's a gap in that connection because people don't leave organizations; they leave supervisors, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think I've seen that play out many times over. I think the other thing that as a team leader you can do is really reduce chaos, right? So if you have not, if you don't have control over yourself, your own stress, and you have not instilled confidence in your team, you're adding to chaos, right?
Yeah.
And so that comes out in very simple forms of, not being able to have an agenda prepared for the meeting. So what are we doing with our time? Not creating structures that people can sort of anticipate and work within. Our goal as leaders is really to create a system for people where they can function so that there's an organizational efficiency, so that I'm not using my mental and emotional space to think about how to do my job, but then also think about how to navigate systems that are out of whack, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's that twofold component to it, so there are several strategies I think as a leader, but what I will say, the big picture is ensuring organizational efficiency,
Mm-hmm.
reducing chaos, and making connections with the folks that you serve.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll second that, reducing chaos, because when I worked in the trenches for annual giving and nonprofit fundraising at a university, the folks who were kind of working on the ground were so disconnected from the decisions that managers and leaders were making that there was always this undercurrent of kind of, well, what's going to happen? Are there going to be layoffs? I heard we didn't make our numbers for the quarter. How's that going to impact us? And when there's not a lot of information coming back down and filtering back down to folks, that can make people very antsy and contribute to that chaos and that feeling of just like, well, I'm not sure. Maybe I'll try to go to another organization that's more stable.
Absolutely.
And so that feeling of stability is really important.
And instability, real or perceived, like that experience of
Yeah.
uncertainty, it's awful.
Right.
If you think about back during the pandemic, that was the hard part. We
Yeah.
couldn't put our stake in anything because the information was changing. That was
sure.
that was the difficulty of it, was the uncertainty.
Yeah.
And so even when you feel sort of uncertain in the moment, how do you you have to restore confidence in the folks that are at the ground level, doing the direct service work. It's imperative. Thank you for lifting it up, Russ. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about kind of the composition of a really fulfilling job? It seems to me like when I've been in positions where I haven't felt fulfilled, I've been spending a lot of time doing reactive things and not spending enough time doing proactive things. What can you do to help kind of balance that out?
I think some of that comes from really like executive leadership and listening, right? And I don't just mean listening. So in Benches in the Bathroom, I give this amazing tool, this SWOT analysis. We've all heard of a SWOT analysis, but this is really a SWOT analysis because it really forces you to start to put a plan in motion from the things that you've been able to assess. And so I really encourage my leaders to plan time with the folks that they serve directly to listen to what the needs are, because often none of us could have predicted a pandemic for sure. None of us would have ever had any thought that a pandemic was coming, but there are things that we can forecast in our organizations if we're listening and if we have our ear to the ground of what our teams are needing and telling us what's working, what are the opportunities and what are the threats, and trying to get ahead of that. In Chicago, we've had a very mild winter this year. We're quite fortunate in that. But last year was pretty cold and dreary for a while. And so I sort of preemptively added an extra 4-day weekend for the team, for everybody. We just closed down. We said we're out on this Monday and on Friday. Why? Because Chicago's long and cold, and my team needed a break in March. Simple as that. Right. Yeah. And so that's a small thing, but it had a really big impact on folks. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
That they could have a chance to sort of recharge and come back, fresh and ready to go. So that's one of the experiences. I think another one is that we moved into a new location and we tripled actually in square footage. So we were sort of crammed into a space that was about 5,000 square feet. And then we now moved into a location that's 12,000. We thought, we have enough space for everyone. Well, there was a lunch period time for our students because we have a school program. And I said, let's plan for 3 lunch groups. And everyone said, well, why? It works with 2. It seemed like extra work. And I said, trust me, let's try to do this over the summer when it's a very low impact and get the kinks worked out. And then so we can be ready to go in the fall. Yeah. And what happened in the fall is that we needed these 3 lunch periods, right? Yeah, so we had a process in place before it became really chaotic, right? It was in place. And so that, again, those are small examples that come to mind, but I think there's forecasting that we have to do as leaders. If we're just looking at the numbers and the trends and we're figuring out what's happening, we're a grassroots organization. In March, we celebrate 10 years.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. But we went from having about 20 team members to almost 55 in what felt like overnight.
Wow.
I felt this trend coming and I felt us accelerating. And so I very quickly hired a director of people, culture, and equity, not only to keep up with the hiring. That's sort of the least of it, but it's also to make sure that the culture that we want in the organization is being passed down, that everyone understands that when we're here, we're leading with grace, which means that we love one another through transitions, that we're connected, which is that we relate to each other like a family, not a staff. And so I wanted to make sure that as we grew, that everybody who came through the door could be a culture bearer. Right. And so that was sort of a proactive thing. I felt I was looking at the numbers and the rate, and I thought, I'm not going to be able to keep up with this. My director of operations is not. We need a person dedicated to just this role.
Yeah, I love that.
I do want to say something about this business of the Great Resignation, which is interesting. Yeah. Because, my new perspective on self-care is really about, as I shared, the individual onus, but also the organization's responsibility for that. One of the things that I saw in the Great Resignation, and 3 people who I care for deeply come to mind that were like, I'm done with this. I'm leaving this place, one nonprofit, one school, and another who was in a corporate law position. So I'm leaving in pursuit of better benefits. And I say better benefits in air quotes because they're thinking about remote work options. They're thinking about increased salary, which are important for all of us, right?
Sure. Flexibility,
compensation, very important. But one thing that people did not look at or explore deeply enough was organizational culture. And so they're leaving one place where they felt like they weren't necessarily working in their purpose. They weren't seen or valued, right? Which is why probably they felt, okay to move into a different workspace, but they hadn't looked at the culture. And so what was happening is that in some instances, they were leaving one bad culture for a worse one. or they're leaving one organization and going to something that was very similar.
Yeah.
And what we know statistically is salary is not equal to job satisfaction, right? Like
Yeah.
it's just one piece of the puzzle. It's not the whole puzzle. And
Right.
so, they're recoining this great resignation as a great regret.
Yep.
And I believe it's because we haven't done our due diligence on what the space is looking like. And even now, I'm in the middle of interviewing for an executive leadership position in my role. And I can count the candidates that have been in front of me that have asked me about the organizational culture. Now, of course, I'm sure they're there. They're taking it in as they're waiting. Imagine this, we're doing in-person interviews, but instead of Zoom. But no one's asked me about these sort of cultural things that I would be asking about, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I've pro-offered them, but yeah. So even still, we haven't quite, that part of the self-care piece hasn't taken off as much as we need to say, let's ask about these organizations we're moving into.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, this is Curtis Schmidt, producer of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. If you're a nonprofit professional who has questions about your program, or maybe you feel like you've taken your advocacy, fundraising, or membership effort as far as you can and you need some fresh ideas, then we have a special offer for you today. NPFX podcast listeners can get a free 30-minute consultation with IPM Advancement, no strings attached, when you go to ipmadvancement.com/free. Just enter a few details and an IPM team member will contact you to follow up. It's that easy. That website again is ipmadvancement.com/free. Thanks for listening, and we hope to talk to you soon. Now let's return to the episode.
Well, tell us a little bit more about this narrative of burnout. What is the common narrative of burnout, and how would you kind of define and redefine success and well-being in the workplace?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this business of burnout really came on my radar during the pandemic, like many of us, in a different way during the pandemic, because I wasn't hearing people saying I'm tired or I'm overwhelmed. What I started to hear more was the environment's toxic, right? And so, which is really a convergence of a lot of things happening in the world at that time. But I started to hear the environment's toxic. And so I started to really think about that. And that's this piece of like, well, what can we do as leaders to make the space not feel toxic for people, right? And so we've had a new surgeons in DEI initiatives and roles and people to say, okay, how do we welcome everybody to the table so that they feel comfortable? At I Can Dream Center, I'm extremely proud that over 20% of my employees identify as neurodivergent. And so we've really worked to make a space where everybody feels like they have something to contribute, there. And so I was contracted during the pandemic to create a workshop on self-care and burnout for leaders in Illinois, specifically school leaders. And as I was compiling the research for it, I thought to myself, this is a book. And it was a book. Now, the form of the book looks nothing like the research and the first outline that I created, of course. The publisher's kind of like, this is great. Well, there's maybe 10% of that left in the actual finished book. But as I was, doing research, I realized that this business of toxic environments and how that impacts them, it wasn't a one-off. Like there were a lot of people across different sectors who were experiencing this, and it really came down to how they were being led and what the organization what the practices of the organization were. Some simple things like in many organizations, they buy back vacation days, or they limit the amount that you can take at one time, or the timing that you can take them. And so it becomes prohibitive in a way. But if I'm in a role where I'm already taking a little bit less compensation because I'm committed to the mission and value of the organization, then being compensated for my vacation day sounds like a really great deal. right? And in the
Yeah.
moment, it might be, but in the long term, it's not, right? You have an employee that's continuing to buy back their vacation days every year.
Yeah.
That means that they're not taking the
That's a red
vacation
flag.
days.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's something to that.
Yeah.
Where in some places it's almost celebrated. I've heard people say, I haven't taken off in X amount
Oh,
of time.
sure. Right. That badge of honor that, I'm always here.
Absolutely. And,
Yeah.
I don't want you always here. So I
Right.
even at all, I want you with your family, connecting, moving, laughing outside of
Yeah,
this place. Right.
absolutely. Yeah.
So
Take care of yourself so you can come back here and be the best person for us.
absolutely. And so for some reason that seemed to be missed on a lot of leaders. And so that was one of the things that came up. I actually forgot the question you asked me.
Yeah, so we were just talking about rewriting the narrative of burnout and defining and redefining success and well-being in the workplace. And so what is the common narrative of that, and maybe how can we change it?
I think we spoke a little bit to that, and that's really like changing what we take pride in, right?
Yeah.
Not no longer celebrating not taking time away or stepping away, not celebrating working, a number of grueling hours without movement, right? How do we get to a place where we start to really encourage our team around things that are going to contribute to their mental and emotional wellness? I had two instructors that would take their lunch break together. And I could look out the window and see them making laps around the building, which I absolutely love. And I would call out and lift up whenever I would step into one of their team meetings that this is exactly what's needed in the middle of the day, right? Like making sure that you're caring for yourself. I am 100% certain that 25 or 30 minutes that they spent doing that made them better for the work that they needed to do later. And how do we start to notice that and celebrate those things?
So do you think, Dr. Ford, that when you're an employee and you're in that situation where you're totally burned out, you're feeling like you want to leave, can you come back from the edge? And how do you do that?
Yeah, I think this is really right back full circle to the first piece about self-awareness, right? Like knowing what would work for you and your own well-being. And I think that if it's something that you're bringing to it, right? Like a lack of organization, I can't quite catch my breath, but it may not necessarily be because of the demands of the organization. It may be because of your own personal practices, right? So am I, running in 5 minutes before a meeting and just sort of shuffling together and getting things together? Or have I given myself the time? Am I scheduling my personal time during the day? Am I blocking the time to answer emails, or am I constantly answering emails all day? Have I prioritized urgent versus important tasks? So those are things we sort of have to ask ourselves and be very honest about. Am I overwhelmed because the work is overwhelming, or am I overwhelmed because I haven't done a proper self-inventory about what I need to do to be successful? So that's the first question.
Okay.
I think the next piece is that if you've seen yourself really thrive in another space, and this is a new space where you feel like, hey, I'm sort of crashing and burning here, then it's time to sort of look at the organizational structures and perhaps have a conversation with the person that you report to directly about the aspects that are most challenging for you.
Yeah.
I'll never forget, I had a meeting, and I talk about this in Benches in the Bathroom as well. I had a meeting with my team, and I thought I was being so clear because I have agendas that I send out a couple days before the meeting. I've asked for contributions to the agendas. I send minutes when we finish, and I still felt like there was some stagnation. And so I kind of put out to the team, like, what can I do to support you more? Like, how can I help? How can I help us to move these things ahead that we've all decided were important? And one of my who was a junior team member at that time, said something that was so enlightening for me. She said, "We just need you to be more clear about the who and the when." So that was such a simple thing, but I had to be open for the feedback. So from there, I sort of identified who was responsible for what, who they needed to check in with, who needed to be brought into the process, and what was the due date. And that was such a simple, quick fix that I started incorporating a RACI board, but I saw my team soar from being able to do just that little bit of something. So I think if she had not been reflective enough to say, we want to really to do these things, here's what we need from you, I could have never done it. So being open and have those kind of honest dialogues with the people that you report to is the next step. So self-inventory, having open and candid conversations. And I think really just thinking about where you want to be long term, right? And
Yeah,
if the environment is one that's going to support the progress that you want to see personally.
That's great. And in terms of how we interact with people in leadership roles, there's often maybe a reticence to criticize them in any way because you don't want to get fired. You don't want to be
Right.
singled out, right?
Right.
And there are a lot of opportunities, I think, for people who are in leadership roles to maybe break down those barriers or make it clear
Mhm.
and kind of set the expectations that, hey, I'm not perfect as a leader, right? I'm not
Exactly.
perfect. I can use you and your feedback to be a better manager and be a better leader of this organization. So feel free to give it. What other advice would you give to leaders and people who are in those positions in terms of helping cultivate that environment that's open, that there's a really positive exchange, and that people don't feel nervous about giving feedback?
Yeah, I think that anytime as a leader you're seeing it seen as being above reproach,
Mhm.
it's already a disaster,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So I end all of my meetings, coaching sessions with my team members saying, "How can I help you? What do you need from me?
yeah.
How can I be a support?" Or I'll say, "What question do you have for me?" For my folks who are very new in leadership or otherwise struggling, I have them to send me a report weekly about what their question, what they've accomplished, what their priorities are. But I always ask them to end with what question they have for me or how I can better support them.
Mm,
So I should start looking for trends, right? Like
yeah,
what are they saying, right?
yeah,
And so
yeah, sure.
some of the feedback I got was, I want you to be more present. And so what I understood about that is that my team members wanted me to see what they were doing
Yeah,
and validate and affirm that they were on the right track. And so I started being more present at their team member meetings and being more present in to observe interactions and exchanges and things like that. So, and
okay.
those are the sort of things that I've been able to incorporate personally, but you have to be open for it. You have to be
Yeah,
open to
yeah,
it. Yeah. And just know
absolutely.
that this is a growing process where, I personally, I don't want to be the same leader today as I was yesterday. To me,
Yeah,
that's a fail.
right,
And,
right.
oftentimes at the top of organizations, and even I can say in my years as an assistant superintendent, I don't think that I got evaluations that I longed for, the ones that were going to really show me how I can get better and think better. But
Yeah,
I did hire a business coach, and he is evaluating me every other week and giving me those tidbits that I need to continue to grow. That's the
nice.
other thing as a leader is you should have someone that you can confide in, whether it's someone that's mentoring you
Hmm.
or a thought partner, not your board necessarily,
Yeah, yeah,
not your leadership team, because remember you have to restore confidence in them, but
sure.
you ought to have thought partners, coaches, people that can come alongside you to support them. I've been able to offer that, in nonprofits, and I've gone in and done wellness series, right, for the
Hmm.
leadership teams, but also been that confidant thought partner for the person at the helm, because we need that. We all need that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
someone to sort of process through and ask the tough questions.
Yeah, wonderful. So at the top of this conversation, we talked a lot about some of the systemic problems that are present that contribute to burnout and issues of retention. What structural or policy changes would you recommend to organizations to at least kind of systematically set in place some guide rails for them to move their organizations forward and to reduce that burnout?
That's a great question, Russ. And I'm glad you asked about the organization's responsibility,
Yeah.
bigger than the leader's responsibility. And I think that, just a few that come to mind really for me is really around the calendar.
Hmm.
So we've moved to a system where a lot of nonprofits really do allow remote working options, and they allow folks to be flexible. And I think we've seen some good um, results that have come from that. I think that there's more to do though. And so
Mm.
for me, working in a therapeutic school environment, staff turnover is much higher than in other environments. And we've not seen that at Icahn Dream Center. And in part, it's because of some simple things like um, we have a 4-day weekend every month. right? And so it's a small thing, but when someone thinks about, one Friday a month and one Monday a month is mine,
Yeah.
it makes a big deal. It makes a big difference, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so those sort of things that we have in place, or we don't have um, a very strict sick policy, right?
Mhm.
So if someone is sick, whether they need a mental health day or they need to take their kids to the dentist, we say, go ahead and do what you need to do, because the reality is that you can't focus on the work at hand if your mind or you is otherwise is somewhere else. And I think that's
Right.
something we can kind of think about as an organization, as organizations. I think having wellness programs in place.
Mhm.
I talked about my team members who are lapping the building for 25 minutes midday, like clockwork. That's usually my sign to get up and walk,
Yeah.
but to move
Yeah.
myself. But I think, how do we start to celebrate some of these wellness programs? One of my team members is a personal trainer, and so
Mhm.
she teaches cycling classes and things. And so I think a lot of offices do happy hours, and those have their place too, to be clear. But I think it's also been really fun to have the team out all working out together, all doing a kickboxing class, all
Yeah.
doing I don't. She had us flipping some tires. I don't know. We were just out there. People said they felt great afterwards. So
Nice. Well,
okay.
that's what
So
matters.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So I think those sort of activities are great too. Having access to water and encouraging water or water drinking competitions, all those things. So I think putting wellness things in place for the team to really be able to draw from and to come together around, right? So that
Yeah.
everybody's, and now I see I'm not a part of this, but I know there's some sort of a challenge going on because I see everybody with these gallons of water. So there's
Yeah.
something happening. I haven't inquired about it yet, though. So yeah,
Nice. Well, excellent.
yeah.
So we're at the end of the conversation, and I'd like for you to just give me your takeaways for people who are listening. I mean, what should people take away from our conversation today about burnout and retention?
The biggest thing that we can do is reduce the impact of that our team members feel, the impact of burnout that they feel and experience. That there's an onus on the individual to be aware of their needs and to make sure that they're putting practices in place, right? But there's an onus on the organization to make sure that they have the structures in place to really make sure that folks are able to show up and be their best and do their best and help to move the mission forward. And at the end of the day,
Mm-hmm.
the people that are most impacted are the ones who we serve in our mission,
Right.
right? So when we
Exactly.
don't do that, whoever you're serving, they're the ones who miss out. They're the ones who don't get to win when we don't put the extra work in to make sure that our team members can do their best.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a way to do it that is going to pay huge dividends because you're just going to love your work more. You're going to love the people you work with and the people you serve, and it's just this wonderful kind of momentum that you get going in the organizations. All right, one last question: what does benches in the bathroom mean?
Well, Russ, I would love to tell you, but I am going to say you're just going to have to read the book. When you buy the
Okay.
book, in the first two lines, you will know why
Okay.
it's called Benches in the
Deal.
Bathroom. And
You
if I
got it.
told you now, it'd be a total spoiler alert.
Okay,
So,
cool. Well,
spoiler.
that's for all our listeners too. So go out and buy Dr. Evisha Ford's book, Benches in the Bathroom. Dr. Ford, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Where can people learn more about you and your work and the book?
Great. Thank you for asking that. I have a website. It's super easy, drevisha.com. And on Amazon, you can put in the search bar, Benches in the Bathroom, the book, and you'll see me as well as an office profile. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ford. Thank you to our producer, Curtis Schmidt. And to you, our listeners, thank you for joining another Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange podcast. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much.
That concludes this episode of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. Thanks to our panel for sharing their insights and expertise. If you'd like to learn more about our panel members or any of the organizations or resources featured in this episode, we will include links in the show notes. If you like this podcast, we would love your help spreading the word. First, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app so you always know when a new episode is released. Second, forward the episodes you like to friends and colleagues or share them on social media. Word of mouth is one of the best ways you can help us reach more nonprofit professionals like yourself. And if you use Apple Podcasts or Audible, please leave us a review. Positive reviews are how many listeners decide whether or not to try out a new podcast. We appreciate your help. For suggestions on topics, guests, or nonprofit organizations you'd like to hear on the podcast, send an email with the subject heading NPFX suggestion to contact@ipmadvancement.com. For back episodes and more resources like white papers, infographics, and blog articles, please visit the free IPM Advancement Nonprofit Resource Library at ipmadvancement.com/resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.